What does it say about this moment in history when an entire continent decides to put €90 billion on the line, not for itself but to keep one embattled democracy alive in the face of a brutal war? Tonight, Europe has just made that bet on Ukraine, and the future of the European order hangs in the balance. According to the head of the European Council, leaders of the European Union have agreed to provide €90 billion in support to Ukraine over 2026 and 2027. This is not a one-off emergency package. It is a multi-year commitment built into the EU's long-term financial planning, a deliberate attempt to guarantee that, even years from now, Ukraine's government will still have the money it needs to function while it is at war. This support is designed to help Kyiv cover core state expenses, salaries for teachers and doctors, wages for soldiers, pensions for the elderly, maintenance and repair of hospitals, schools, roads, bridges, and especially the power grid, which has been repeatedly targeted by Russian missiles and drones. It is essentially a pledge to keep the Ukrainian state on its feet as the war stretches on. European officials have been clear that this funding is not unconditional. Portions of it will be linked to reform milestones inside Ukraine, anti-corruption efforts, judicial reforms, modernization of state institutions. This means Europe is not just trying to help Ukraine survive the war. It is also pushing Ukraine to evolve into a state compatible with EU membership in the long run, so €90 billion over 2 years, for a country under fire, with strings attached, not to control it but to help bend it fully into the European fold. To understand the scale of this decision, you have to understand the moment in which it comes. We are now deep into the war that began when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. What many in the West once hoped might be a sharp, decisive conflict has congealed into a long war of attrition. There are no quick breakthroughs now, only slow, grinding advances measured in meters and in lives. According to verified international reporting, Ukraine's economy has been severely damaged, industrial plants have been destroyed, farmland has been mined or occupied, export routes have been disrupted. Millions of citizens, working-age people, professionals, skilled laborers have been displaced, either inside the country or across Europe as refugees. Tax revenues have plunged, even as military and social spending have skyrocketed. Ukraine today is trying to do two things that are almost impossible to do at the same time: fight a large-scale war and run a normal country. Without extensive external funding, the normal country part simply breaks. Europe has been providing support since the beginning of the invasion, tens of billions in financial, military, and humanitarian aid. But until now, much of that help has been structured as a series of short-term measures, constantly renewed, constantly negotiated, constantly vulnerable to political mood swings in individual states. This new €90 billion pledge is different in kind. It states bluntly, "We know this is not ending next month. We are planning for 2026 and 2027 now." It treats the war not as a shock to be ridden out, but as the new strategic landscape in which Europe expects to live. So what does €90 billion actually do? According to EU officials and publicly available budget outlines, this support will be structured mostly as macro-financial assistance, long-term, low-interest loans, and some grants, directed to Ukraine's state budget. It is not one gigantic check. It will be dispersed in tranches, likely tied to conditions and reporting. On the ground, that translates into things like public sector salaries, teachers, nurses, firefighters, civil servants, and security services whose pay would otherwise be in jeopardy. Social payments, pensions for elderly citizens who have survived Soviet collapse, economic chaos, and now war, disability payments for the wounded, basic welfare, infrastructure repair, patching up power stations, repairing water systems, fixing roads and bridges, rebuilding schools and clinics that are constantly being hit or threatened. Energy security, buying fuel, repairing grids, installing backup systems to keep homes heated and lights on during winter under missile attack. Without this kind of support, Ukraine would face a state-level collapse, not just battlefield losses, but the erosion of everyday life, no salaries, no services, no expectation that things will function from one month to the next. And because the money is planned over 2026-2027, it gives Kyiv something it has lacked since the invasion began: predictability. The ability to build a budget not just for the next quarter, but for the next few years. In wartime, predictable finance can be almost as important as predictable ammunition. At the same time, the reform conditionality is real. According to European officials, payments will likely be contingent on benchmarks: reducing corruption in customs and public procurement, strengthening the judiciary, improving transparency in state-owned enterprises, building digital governance systems that limit opportunities for graft. The EU is effectively saying to Ukraine, We will help keep your state alive, but we will also push you to make that state better. Because if you are to become part of the European Union, this painful transformation has to happen, even under fire. None of this came easily. Inside the EU, support for Ukraine has become a fault line. On one side, governments, especially in Eastern and Northern Europe, that see Russia's invasion as an existential threat, not only to Ukraine, but to European security as a whole. On the other, governments facing intense domestic pressure from voters weary of war, angry about costs, and open to messaging that says enough. According to reporting from multiple international outlets, at least one EU leader has repeatedly threatened to use his veto power to block large funding packages to Ukraine, criticizing Brussels for pushing countries into what he describes as someone else's conflict. This has turned several EU summits into high-stakes showdowns, with 26 countries lined up on one side and a lone spoiler on the other, backed by far-right sympathy elsewhere. In the run-up to this €90 billion decision, diplomats describe nights of intense negotiations, offers of compromise, pressure applied through other budgetary channels, a complex dance in which the EU's reputation for unity was at stake, alongside Ukraine's survival. The fact that the package was ultimately approved tells us two things. First, that a critical mass of European leaders still believe that abandoning Ukraine would be more dangerous and more expensive in the long run than supporting it. Second, that the internal pressure on that consensus is very real. Rising populist parties in several major EU states now campaign on promises to scale back aid, end sanctions, or normalize relations with Moscow. So this 90 billion is not the product of a calm, settled Europe. It is the product of a divided, anxious Europe that, despite its fears and disagreements, has chosen for now to stay the course. From Moscow's perspective, this decision lands like a shot across the bow. Russian strategy, as many analysts and officials have noted, leans heavily on time. The Kremlin bets that Western democracies will tire, that after a first wave of outrage and sanctions, solidarity will fracture, that rising living costs will turn public opinion inward, that elections will bring in leaders more sympathetic to Russia or simply more indifferent to Ukraine. The EU's multi-year commitment is designed precisely to counter that bet. By fixing support into the 2026-2027 EU framework, Europe is trying to lock in political will beyond the next news cycle or electoral drama. It creates a baseline expectation. Unless something extraordinary happens, Ukraine will receive this funding regardless of who happens to be in power in one or two member states at any given moment. This is Europe telling Russia, you are not the only one who can play the long game. It also aims to complicate Moscow's narrative at home. Russian state media has spent years telling its public that the collective West is decadent, weak, easily distracted, and incapable of sustained sacrifice. When the EU commits to a package of this scale, for this length of time, it chips away at that story. Still, the Kremlin will no doubt respond by trying to raise the costs further, hitting infrastructure, tightening energy leverage where it can, using disinformation and political interference to stoke divisions inside the EU itself. The battle is not just on the front line, it is inside European politics. There's another capital watching this decision very closely, Washington, D.C. From the start of this war, the United States has been Ukraine's largest single military supporter. But Ukraine policy has now become entangled in internal American political warfare. According to widely reported congressional battles, major assistance bills have been delayed or blocked, with some lawmakers arguing that U.S. resources should be redirected inward, or that Europe should carry a much larger share of the burden. The EU's $90 billion move is a direct answer to that argument. It says, in effect, we hear you, and we are increasing our share. This does not mean Europe can replace the United States, especially in terms of advanced weaponry and deterrence. But it does mean that if U.S. support fluctuates because of domestic politics or changes in leadership, Ukraine will not be left entirely without a Western lifeline. For European leaders whose own security is directly tied to what happens in Ukraine, this is not charity, it is contingency planning. It is also a quiet bid to preserve the transatlantic relationship on different terms. If the U.S. sees Europe stepping up financially and strategically, it becomes harder to frame Ukraine as a one-sided American burden. The goal for many in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and beyond is a division of labor. Europe takes more of the financial and reconstruction weight. The U.S. continues to anchor the high-end military and deterrence dimension. Behind closed doors, this is how many officials now talk about a West that adapts instead of one that splinters. Strip away the geopolitics, and this story is brutally human. In Europe, €90 billion is a number people can feel, even if they don't fully grasp it. It sits beside stories of underfunded hospitals, crowded schools, crumbling infrastructure at home. It is easy for a populist politician to point at this package and say, why for them, not for you? For a worker in a struggling factory in Italy, or a nurse in an overburdened hospital in Germany, or a farmer in France fighting higher costs? That question is not abstract. It's personal. Politicians who support Ukraine now have to look those voters in the eye and argue, this money is not taking away from your security, it is part of securing your future. Because if Russia succeeds in carving up Ukraine by force and normalizing that outcome, the signal to the rest of the world is stark. Borders can be changed by war again. That risk doesn't stay in Eastern Europe. But it also tells her, this will not be over soon. For a soldier standing in a trench near the front, the news comes through on a phone passed from hand to hand. He may not live to see 2026 or 2027. For him, the most immediate question is ammunition, air support, rotations. And yet deep down he knows, if the state collapses behind him, there is nothing left to defend. That is what this €90 billion really buys. Not victory tomorrow, but the continuity of a country, so that the sacrifices of those on the front line are not in defense of a state that ceases to function halfway through the war. So where does that leave us? Europe has taken a step that is bolder than its often cautious, technocratic language suggests. It has decided in the middle of a grinding war to lock in €90 billion for a country under siege, money that will be spent under future governments, in future parliaments, amid future crises we cannot yet see. It is a wager on several fronts. A wager that Ukraine will still be there to receive this support and still be fighting for its independence. A wager that European societies will accept the costs and not rebel against them in a way that shatters this commitment. A wager that supporting Ukraine now will be cheaper in lives and in money than dealing with a victorious, emboldened Russia later. But tonight, in Brussels, that decision has been made. And tonight, in Kyiv, in Mykolaiv, in Zaporizhia, in countless towns and villages scarred by shelling, people can look at that number and see something more than just euros. They can see a signal that they have not been written off, that their fight still matters beyond their own borders, that their future is not being quietly traded away in back rooms. Europe has put its money on the table. Now the world will watch to see if that bet on Ukraine, on democracy, on the idea that might does not make right, can hold through another year of war.